The Battle of Little Bighorn, often romanticized in American history, represents a pivotal moment of westward expansion and Native American resistance. On June 25, 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry met a devastating defeat at the hands of a confederation of Native American warriors, led by prominent leaders such as Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. This battle was far more than a simple military engagement. It was a profound clash of cultures, ideologies, and fundamental approaches to land, sovereignty, and survival. Hello, and welcome to Deadliest Disasters, where we cover some of the most devastating events that happened throughout history. The mid-19th century was a period of unprecedented territorial growth for the United States. Following the Louisiana Purchase and subsequent acquisitions, the federal government pursued an aggressive policy of westward expansion. This expansion was driven by a complex mix of economic opportunity, political ambitions, and a prevailing ideology of manifest destiny. The belief that American settlers were destined to occupy and civilize the entire continent. In this video, we'll examine the details leading up to Custer's last stand. The Treaty of Fort Laramie, also known as the Sioux Treaty of 1868, was an agreement between the United States and 3 different bands of Lakota people, the Yanktonai Dakota, and the Arapaho Nation. The treaty established the Great Sioux Reservation, including ownership of the Black Hills, and set aside additional lands as unceded Indian territory in the areas of South Dakota, Wyoming, Nebraska, and parts of Montana. It established that the U.S. government would hold authority to punish not only white settlers who committed crimes against the tribes, but also tribe members who committed crimes and were to be delivered to the government, rather than to face charges in tribal courts. The discovery of gold in the West and the construction of the Union Pacific Railroad led to substantially increased travel through the area, largely outside of the 1851 Sioux Territory. This increasingly led to clashes between the tribes, settlers, and the U.S. government, and eventually open war in the year 1866 between the Sioux, who along with the Cheyenne and Arapaho refugees from the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado, versus the whites. The government eventually broke the terms of the treaty following the Black Hills Gold Rush and an expedition into the area by George Armstrong Custer in 1874. The government failed to prevent white settlers from moving onto tribal lands, and rising tensions eventually led to the Great Sioux War of 1876. George Armstrong Custer, born December 5, 1839, was a United States Army officer and cavalry commander in the American Civil War and the American Indian Wars. Custer graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York. He was last in his graduating class of 1861. Nonetheless, Custer achieved a higher military rank than any other U.S. Army officer in his class. Following graduation, he worked closely with future Union Army generals George B. McClellan and Alfred Pleasonton, both of whom recognized his abilities as a cavalry leader. He was promoted in the early American Civil War to Brevet Brigadier General of Volunteers at the young age of 23. Only a few days afterwards, he fought at the pivotal Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania in early July 1863, where he commanded the Michigan Brigade. Despite being outnumbered, the new General Custer defeated Confederate States Army cavalry of General J.E.B. Stuart's attack at East Cavalry Field on the crucial 3rd day of the Gettysburg Clash. Custer was known for his aggressive tactics and personal flamboyance. He cultivated a public persona of heroism and fearlessness, which often translated into reckless military decision-making. After his victories during the Civil War, Custer was commissioned as a lieutenant colonel in the standing regular army and was sent west to fight in the ongoing Indian Wars. The Native American Confederation was led by some of the most formidable leaders of the time. Sitting Bull, a Hunkpapa Lakota chief, was a spiritual and political leader who had united various tribes in resistance against U.S. expansion. Crazy Horse, an Oglala Lakota war leader, was renowned for his tactical brilliance and unwavering commitment to preserving tribal lands and ways of life. These leaders represented a sophisticated political and military alliance. They understood that survival required unity and strategic resistance against the increasingly aggressive U.S. military campaigns. The Battle of Little Bighorn, known to the Lakota and other Plains Indians as the Battle of the Greasy Grass and commonly referred to as Custer's Last Stand, was an armed engagement between combined forces of the Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes versus the 7th Cavalry Regiment of the United States Army. The 7th Cavalry Regiment fought with the help of scouts from the Crow and Arapaho tribes. The battle took place on June 25th and 26th of 1876 along the Little Bighorn River in the Crow Indian Reservation in southeastern Montana Territory. The battle, which resulted in the defeat of U.S. forces, was the most significant action of the Great Sioux War of 1876. Most battles in the Great Sioux War, including the Battle of Little Bighorn, were on lands that the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes had taken from other, smaller tribes. The Lakotas were there without consent from the local Crow tribe, which had a treaty on the area. In 1873, Crow Chief Blackfoot had called for U.S. military actions against the native intruders. The steady Lakota incursions into treaty areas belonging to the smaller tribes were a direct result of their displacement by the United States in and around Fort Laramie, as well as in reaction to white encroachment into the Black Hills. This pre-existing Indian conflict provided a useful wedge for colonization and ensured the United States a firm Indian alliance with the Arikaras and the Crows during the Lakota Wars. Colonization was always the prevailing reason to war with the non-conforming Indian tribes, but also gold being discovered in the Black Hills proved to be a major influence in the U.S. involvement in the Great Sioux Wars. Although many battles took place during the 2-year-long Sioux Wars, the Battle of Little Bighorn was one of the biggest losses suffered from the U.S. Army and by far the biggest blunder of Custer. According to historian James Donovan, as Custer's army moved into the field on its expedition, it was operating with incorrect assumptions as to the number of Indians it would encounter. These assumptions were based on inaccurate information provided by Native American scouts that no more than 800 hostiles were in the area. The scouts based this estimate on the number of Lakota that Sitting Bull and other leaders had reportedly led off the reservation in protest of U.S. government policies. This was in fact a correct estimate until several weeks before the battle when the reservation Indians joined Sitting Bull's ranks for the summer buffalo hunt. The scouts working with the U.S. Army did not consider the many thousands of these reservation Indians would soon join the ranks. Thus, Custer unknowingly faced an unforeseen amount of hostiles that he and his army were unprepared for. All of the Army's plans were based on incorrect numbers. Although Custer was criticized after the battle for not having accepted reinforcements and for dividing his forces, it appears that he had accepted the official government estimates of hostiles in the area. Custer divided his regiment into 3 distinct groups of battalions, one led by Custer himself, one led by Reno, and one by Benetine. This would be a tactical decision that would prove fatal. Believing he could quickly overwhelm the Native American encampment, he attacked without waiting for reinforcements or conducting thorough reconnaissance. The Native American warriors, numbering over 2,500 fighters, were prepared and strategically positioned. The first group to attack was Major Reno's 2nd Detachment. Reno and his men were ordered to charge. The orders, made without accurate knowledge of the village size, location, or the warriors' propensity to stand and fight, had been to pursue the Native Americans and bring them to battle. Reno's force crossed the Little Bighorn at the mouth of what is today Reno Creek around 3 p.m. on June 25th. They immediately realized that the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne were present in force and not running away. After about 20 minutes of long-distance firing, Reno had only taken 1 casualty, but the odds against him had risen. Reno estimated 5-to-1 odds against him. Custer had not reinforced him. Trooper Billy Jackson reported that by then, the Indians had begun massing in the open area shielded by a small hill to the left of Reno's line and to the right of the Indian village. From this position, the Indians mounted an attack of more than 500 warriors against the left and the rear of Reno's line. This forced a hasty withdrawal into the trees along the bend of the river. Here, the Native Americans pinned Reno and his men down and set fire to the brush to try to drive the soldiers out of their position. Major Reno's Arikara scout, Bloody Knife, was shot in the head, splattering brains and blood onto Reno's face. The shaken Reno ordered his men and said, "All those who wish to make their escape, follow me." Reno, abandoning the wounded and inevitably dooming them to their deaths, led a disorderly route for a mile next to the river. He made no attempt to engage the Indians to prevent them from picking off men in the rear. His retreat was immediately disrupted by the Cheyenne. They fired on the soldiers from a distance and within close quarters pulled them off their horses and clubbed their heads. Later, Reno reported that 3 officers and 29 troopers had been killed during the retreat. Another officer and 13 to 18 men were missing. Most of these missing men were left behind in the timber, although many eventually rejoined the detachment. Atop the bluffs known today as Reno Hill, Reno's depleted and shaken troops were joined about a half hour later by Captain Benettine's division. This force had been returning from a lateral scouting mission when it had been summoned by Custer's messenger, Italian immigrant bugler John Martin, with a handwritten message. Quote, "Benetine, come on. Big village, be quick, bring packs. P.S. Bring packs." Unquote. This message made no sense to Benetine, as his men would be needed more in a fight than the packs carried by herd animals. Though both men inferred that Custer was engaged in battle, Reno refused to move until the packs arrived so his men could resupply. The 14 officers and 340 troopers on the bluffs organized an all-around defense and dug rifle pits using whatever implements they had among them. This practice had become standard during the last year of the American Civil War, as Union and Confederate troops used knives, eating utensils, mess plates, and pans to dig effective battlefield fortifications. Despite hearing heavy gunfire from the north, including distinct volleys at 4:20 p.m., Benetine concentrated on reinforcing Reno's badly wounded and hard-pressed detachment rather than continuing on toward Custer's position. Benetine's apparent reluctance to reach Custer prompted later criticism that he had failed to follow orders. Around 5 p.m., Captain Thomas Weir and his troops moved out to contact Custer. Behind them, he saw through the dust and smoke the hills were oddly red in color. He later learned that this was a massive assemblage of Indian horses. By roughly 5:25 p.m., Custer's battle may have concluded. From a distance, Weir witnessed many Indians on horseback and on foot shooting at items on the ground, perhaps killing wounded soldiers and firing at dead bodies on the last stand hill at the northern end of the Custer battlefield. The other entrenched companies eventually left Reno Hill and followed Weir by assigned battalions, first Benetine, then Reno, and finally the pack train. The men on Weir Ridge were attacked by natives, increasingly coming from the apparently concluded Custer engagement, forcing all 7 companies to return to the bluff. The companies remained pinned down on the bluff, fending off the Indians for 3 hours until night fell. The soldiers dug crude trenches as the Indians performed their war dance. According to Indian accounts, about 40 men on Custer Hill made a desperate stand around Custer, delivering volley fire. The great majority of the Indian casualties were probably suffered during this closing segment of the battle. Modern historians and archaeologists suggest that there may not have been a quote-unquote last stand, as traditionally portrayed in popular culture. Instead, archaeologists suggest that in the end, Custer's troops were not surrounded but rather overwhelmed by a single charge. This scenario corresponds to several Indian accounts stating Crazy Horse's charge swarmed the resistance with the surviving soldiers fleeing in panic. The fight was an overwhelming victory for the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho, who were led by several major war leaders, including Crazy Horse and Chief Gall, and had been inspired by the visions and teachings of Sitting Bull. The U.S. 7th Cavalry, a force of 700 men commanded by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, suffered a major defeat. 5 of the 7th Cavalry's 12 companies were wiped out and Custer was killed, as were 2 of his brothers, his nephew, and his brother-in-law. The total U.S. casualty count included 268 dead and 55 severely wounded, 6 having died later from their wounds. This included 4 Crow Indian Scouts and at least 2 Arapaho Indian Scouts. Public response to the Great Sioux War varied in the immediate aftermath of the battle. Custer's widow, Libby Custer, soon worked to burnish her husband's memory, and during the following decades, Custer and his troops came to be considered heroic figures in American history. The battle, and Custer's actions in particular, have been studied extensively by historians. By the 1930s, Custer's heroic public image began to tarnish after the death of his widow in 1933 at the age of 90. The publication of Glory Hunter, The Life of General Custer by Frederick F. Vanderwater was the first book to depict Custer in unheroic terms. The timing of both instances, combined with the cynicism of an economic depression and historical revisionism, led to a more realistic view of Custer and his defeat on the banks of the Little Bighorn River. The battle became a powerful symbol in American mythology. For many, Custer was transformed into a martyr, a heroic figure who made a last stand against overwhelming odds. But many saw him as being overly confident and foolish during his battles. Quoted in the New York Herald on September 2, 1876, Commanding General and President Ulysses S. Grant said, quote, "I regard Custer's massacre as a sacrifice of troops, brought on by Custer himself, that was wholly unnecessary, unquote." Like many great men of the time, George Armstrong Custer led a very divisive life. He was a hero and martyr, but also someone who was despised for his actions toward a few of the Native American tribes. He will forever be known for his bravery leading the Union Army to victory in the American Civil War, but also he will live in infamy for his role in the Indian Wars and his death at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Thanks for watching today's video on this devastating but important historical event. If you found this informative, please hit that like button and subscribe for more historical deep dives, and let me know in the comments what other overlooked historical events you'd like to learn about. Until next time, this has been Deadliest Disasters.